Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we are jumping into one of the most powerful and honestly most turbulent stories of the last 100 years, the global battle for human rights. It's a story about radical ideas, about people courageously challenging the old ways of doing things, and it's a revolution that, as you'll see, is still very much unfolding today.
And it really all starts right here. Picture this. It's 1948. The world is in ashes after two devastating world wars, and the global community comes together to make a promise. This one sentence. This was an absolutely radical statement. It said that your rights don't come from a government, they don't come from a king, they belong to you just because you're human.
Okay, so let's get into our first chapter, the birth of this universal idea. I mean, it's one thing to have a beautiful sentence on paper, but how do you turn that into a real framework for action across the entire globe?
Well, first, you've got to define it. And the concept was simple, but so profound. Human rights are the basic protections and freedoms that belong to everyone. Not just citizens of one country, but all of humanity. No exceptions. And that simple idea, it would become the moral foundation for challenging injustice just about everywhere.
You know, what's really fascinating here is how quickly they tried to put this idea into practice. The brand new United Nations didn't just publish a nice document and call it a day. No, it started building an actual framework. It created UNICEF, right? Because children have a right to be safe and fed. It established a world court, because nations deserve a path to justice. And it set up agencies to protect the most vulnerable people on Earth, refugees. This was a massive attempt to build a world where rights weren't just declared, but were actually defended.
So here's the thing. Once you declare that all human beings have rights, you better believe that the people who've been denied those rights their whole lives are going to start demanding them. And that set the stage for a century of struggle.
And wow, does this timeline tell that story? Just look at the fight for a right as basic as voting. It wasn't one single victory. It was this grueling, staggered, country-by-country fight that stretched over more than 100 years. And look at the details here. Limited rights in Britain. Rights just for white women in the US. It wasn't until 1962 for indigenous women in Australia. The universal idea was there, for sure, but making it a universal reality, that was a whole different battle.
The fight for racial equality was another huge front, and you can see these parallel struggles happening all over the world. So, in the United States, you had activists fighting against segregation, which led to those landmark laws in the 1960s. At the very same time, halfway around the globe, in South Africa, a very similar battle was being waged against a system of state-enforced segregation they called apartheid.
And it's so important to understand what apartheid really was. This wasn't just social prejudice. It was a legal, institutional system designed from the ground up to separate people by race and to make sure all the political and economic power stayed in the hands of a tiny minority. And this really puts it all into perspective. Just 15% of the population, the white minority, controlled literally everything. For the huge majority of black South Africans, the system meant terrible schools, rules about where you could live and work, and absolutely no political power. But systems of injustice, they always create resistance. The African National Congress, the ANC, led by incredible figures like Nelson Mandela, spearheaded decades of struggle. I mean, despite imprisonment, despite violent crackdowns, their fight, combined with pressure from all over the world, eventually brought that system down. And that led to South Africa's very first truly democratic elections in 1994.
All right, so as the 20th century moved on, something else started to happen. The very idea of what counts as a right began to grow, expanding way beyond just politics and into totally new areas of life. Suddenly, people started asking questions like this. I mean, think about it. Is having clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, is that a fundamental human right?
And a whole new wave of movements answered with a huge yes. And this wasn't just one single group. It was this diverse, global thing. You had the massive public awareness of Earth Day, the direct action tactics of Greenpeace, and amazing community-led efforts like the Green Belt movement in Kenya. People started demanding environmental protection as a right, not just for themselves, but for generations to come.
The idea of rights also pushed its way into the global economy. Movements for fair trade started to argue that, hey, economic justice is a human right too. They were asking, what good is your right to vote if you're being exploited at work? And as you can see, the principles they laid out, things like fair prices and no child labor, were a direct challenge to an economic system that often put profits above people.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most important chapter, because for every single step forward in the fight for rights, there have been brutal, terrible steps back. This revolution, it is so far from being finished.
Sometimes a single photo can just capture an entire struggle, and this image of one unarmed man standing in front of a line of tanks, it became a global symbol of defiance against overwhelming state power. This was Tiananmen Square in 1989.
So, for 7 weeks before that photo was taken, students and other citizens had been peacefully protesting in the square asking for democratic reforms. The government's response was to declare martial law, and then the army moved in. Now, the official state account still claims that no one died, but outside estimates suggest that hundreds, maybe even thousands, of unarmed civilians were killed. It was a horrific reminder that the fight for basic rights can be met with the most violent suppression imaginable.
So after all that, what are the big things to take away from this? First, that simple idea of universal rights was genuinely revolutionary. It challenged centuries of assumptions about who gets to have power. Second, this idea led to real, tangible changes, opening doors to education and new opportunities for millions. Third, the definition of rights itself grew, expanding to include our planet and our economy. And finally, and this is the most important one, this is not a history lesson with a neat ending. It is an ongoing, continuous struggle.
And that really leaves us with this question to think about. The last century put the idea of universal rights on the global stage. The great challenge for our century, for us, is how we will defend those rights from all the forces that want to tear them down, and how we will continue to expand our understanding of what it truly means for every single person to live in freedom and dignity.